Hey everyone, I'm Rashad Robinson. I'm the president of Color of Change, and we are back for another edition of the Black Response. We are talking about all of the ways in which, in this moment, we build the political and cultural of power of Black communities to be able to win, not just through the COVID crisis, but through all of the other ways in which the systems and the structures have been designed to fail us, been designed to harm us, been designed to target us. I am incredibly excited because I'm here with one of my favorite elected officials, one of my favorite leaders, Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, the great town of Oakland. My friends call it the town. Welcome, Congresswoman Lee, to the conversation.
Thank you, Rashad. Listen, I'm so happy to be with you today. And first, let me just give you and Color of Change a shout out and remind you of a little bit of the history. Yes. Move On was established and founded in my district in Berkeley, California. And for so long, I was pushing to broaden Move On's base and the issues to include people of color. And so voila, Color of Change emerged. And I just want to say how proud I am of what you're doing, Rashad, and what Color of Change is doing, because finally we have this presence that we needed that really expanded from when Move On started. And really, you're really helping to transform this country. And you're helping, and to also make sure that people of color are involved and included in this democratic process. And so, you don't know, Color of Change is my favorite outside organization that pushes us on the inside to do the right thing. So it's really good to be with you.
It's great to be with you. I'm so glad. And, we're going to talk about a number of things in this conversation. One thing that I've always appreciate about you, Congresswoman, is your history of activism, from the Black Panthers, from the work on the ground in communities as an organizer, as a political leader, and as an operative, and then your work then to move into elected office. And I think for a lot of folks who are looking to find all the different ways that we make change, how are we of service in this moment? I'd love for you just to share a little bit about your journey as we get into some of the media issues around the policies that we're pushing and the fights that are ahead of us. But a little bit about that sort of journey from organizer, activist, politician, representative, all those things that are so much a part of your story.
Thanks so much, Rashad. Well, it really started when I was born. And so I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. And my mother was denied entry into the hospital when she was about to have me. She needed a C-section. And because she was Black, they wouldn't admit her. She almost died. Someone saw her, and my grandmother, long story, but finally got her into the hospital. They left her on what she always reminded me was a gurney in the hall. And no one tended to her. She became unconscious. Someone saw her, rushed her into the emergency room. It was too late to do a C-section. She almost died. They had to deliver me using forceps. And I almost didn't make it into this world. And so that's how my journey started, fighting for justice and to end racism, and for health care for women and for men and for Black people and people of color. So it started way back in the day. As a child in El Paso, Texas, it was segregated, and I couldn't go to public schools, couldn't go to theaters. My mother was one of the first 12 students to enter into desegregate the University of Texas at El Paso. My grandfather was first Black letter carrier in El Paso, Texas, very involved with the NAACP. So I grew up kind of like challenging injustices as a child, because I almost didn't make it here because I was Black. So fast forward, when I was 14, in high school, I wanted to be a cheerleader. We moved to California, Southern California. Couldn't become a cheerleader because I was Black. They had a little select committee, and you had to be blonde and blue-eyed to be a cheerleader. So I went to the NAACP. I said, this ain't right. I want to be a cheerleader. So the NAACP helped me organize against my school and against those rules, forced them to change the rules at San Fernando High School, where girls could try out in front of the student body. Guess what? I won. So I was the first Black cheerleader at San Fernando High School. That year, a Japanese American girl won. So I kind of, it's just been part of who I am. So when I moved to Northern California and went to college, of course, by then I said politics was not for me. I was like Black Lives Movement all the way, and I was a community worker with the Black Panther Party, president of Black Student Union in Mills College, and very involved with the survival programs of the Black Panther Party, helped Bobby Seale run for mayor and fundraise for him, Elaine Brown for city council. I helped Huey Newton do the research for his book, Revolutionary Suicide.
I did the book. If you haven't read Revolutionary Suicide, it's an excellent book. Yeah.
And my name's in the front of it too. Yeah. So I was very active in the community while raising two young Black boys as a single mom, had been in a very terrible domestic violence situation, on welfare, the whole 9 yards. And so I was not unlike a lot of Black women I knew. Yeah. So I'm at Mills College, it's all women's college. I'm president of Black Student Union. I have a class in government. And I say, my professor wanted us to work in a presidential campaign. I've never flunked a class. I said, flunk me. I'm not going to work with any of these white guys because they're not speaking to any of the issues. And I mean, I was very aware of politics and the Democratic Party, but that was not for me because I didn't think the two-party system was worth anything. It wasn't dealing with like what a lot of young people think today. It's not relevant. So, but I had a little budget, and as president of Black Student Union, while I'm flunking this class, I invite Shirley Chisholm to come to Mills College. And she's the first African-American woman from Brooklyn elected to Congress. So I invited her as the first African-American member of Congress, woman member of Congress. And she said she was running for president. I said, no way. And Shirley was brilliant though. She spoke fluent Spanish. A lot of people don't know that. She talked about immigrant rights. She was an educator. She also talked about ending the Vietnam War. She was really out there in terms of the Vietnam War. She was pro-choice. She was one of the founding members of NARAL. A lot of people don't know that. And she was like brilliant. And she talked about being Black and being a Black woman and challenging the system that was not developed and designed for us. And so I went up and talked to her afterwards and told her, well, you know, I have this class I'm about to flunk because they're making me work in a campaign. She took me to task. She says, and she called me little girl, even though I had, you know, my big afro and jeans, my two little boys were with me. To the day she died, she called me little girl, and I love her so much. So she told me I had to register to vote. And she took me to task, and she told me that she better never ever hear me saying that I don't believe in politics or getting on the inside. She said, if you really believe in what you say, then you've got to get in there, and you've got to not play by the rules, but you got to get in there and you got to change those rules because they weren't made for you and I. She said, so why don't you, rethink your whole thing about politics? So I said, okay. I said, well, I'll at least try to pass my class. What I do? She said, first you got to register to vote. Then she said, I don't have a lot of money for my campaign, not a national campaign, but I'm leaving up to my local organizers. So I went back to my class, asked my professor, Dr. Mullins, what to do. She said, well, that's part of the classwork. Bottom line is, I found some other students, student body president, who later became my chief of staff in Congress, student at Laney College, and a couple of other people, young students. And we organized the Shirley Chisholm Northern California campaign out of my class at Mills College. I have registered to vote. We got 10% of the vote in Alameda County. And I went on, I got an A in the class, and then went on to Miami, Florida as a Shirley Chisholm delegate. And then I started working with Rondell. The rest is history. And so I shared that. I'm glad you asked me because so many young people right now, I can relate to because I was right there. And I feel it because I've been doing this a long time and I'm still like pushing. But it's a marathon. We have to run our lap of this race because this is about the future and it's for our young people. And we can't say, we're not going to work to push or get involved in politics because that leaves it up to the rest of them to develop the policies and to, run our lives in a way that is oppressive and dangerous and bad.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that because it really does sort of speak to sort of the kind of conflict that so many folks are having as we're working to sort of push change, recognizing that in so many ways, a lot of these systems are not broken. They're operating exactly the way they were designed. And that's why changing the rules, changing the system is going to be so incredibly important. Changing how we budget, changing how we think about resources. And so I'm interested sort of, you've tweeted about sort of a number of things recently and talked about publicly about a number of things recently as it relates to this moment we're in and talking about policing and criminal justice. And you've talked a little bit about sort of an issue that a lot of people might not know about, and it's about qualified immunity. And I've gone big in terms of the big story. Now I'm going to jump into some of the policies. I'd love for you to talk about qualified immunity and some of the other things that you feel are sort of on the table in terms of the things we're working to fight. But I'd also love for you to talk about a little bit about, in general, the larger questions around funding, around how do we deal with actually getting resources into our communities to make them whole, so everything that we need isn't up to police.
Sure. Rashad, thank you very much for that, because, well, during impeachment, you heard us say no one is above the law, right? Qualified immunity means police officers are not above the law. If they commit a crime, okay, they should be prosecuted for a crime, and that there should not be immunity, which prevents, which protects them from lawsuits and protects their jobs, because they have this qualified immunity. And so we're saying in our legislation, Justice and Policing Act, that we want to end qualified immunity, that if a police officer murders someone, there should not be policies and laws in place to protect them from being prosecuted. And that's what that's about. Also, as simple as that. A lot of people don't even know that this exists, and they wonder why these cops keep getting off. Well, that's part of the reason. Secondly, part of what we have in this bill, and coming from Oakland, this is a big deal in terms of the militarization of the police department. We prevent the Pentagon from transferring weapons of war onto the streets of America. There's a 1033 program. Yeah. And we're saying that can't exist. We should not allow this to happen. The hardware that the police department have, that needs to go. But minimally, we should, in our bill, in which we do, we really restrict that transfer. Also, it's important that we have funding, and let me just share this story with you. When I was in the California legislature, Rashad, I served for 7.5 years in Sacramento. I was on the Public Safety Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, which is comparable to the Appropriations Committee now, okay, that I'm on. Okay, every year, the prison system brought forth proposals to build prisons. Guess what? These architectural designs, these requests for land acquisition, were to build prisons for kids who were currently in kindergarten, okay? They were like a 10-year out, 12-year out plan. We're saying, what the heck? Of course, I couldn't support it and fought against it, but then California became one of the biggest prison industrial complexes in the world. And then boggled my mind. And I would argue, look, you're asking for billions of dollars for these kids who are 5 and 6 years old, because these plans are 10 years out. Why don't you put these resources into their schools right now? Why don't you build decent schools? Why don't you make sure they have quality education? Why don't you put money on the front end so you don't need these big prisons funded? And I think we're at that point also now in terms of what we're talking about as it relates to divest, deconstruct, whatever we want to call it. We have to make sure that funding is put on the front end and into areas where we can minimize deaths and destruction and have some sort of equity in our communities that don't require over-policing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so important. I do think that people want solutions that feel like if we just implement these policies, we can keep everything else the same. But I think your point, right, around how if we put bad money in, we get bad product out. And we have to sort of look at where we're putting good money in so we can get good results out in terms of communities. It's, I think, so incredibly important. And it speaks to like the tough decisions that have to be made constantly in Congress in terms of those incentive structures. I'm interested, as a person on the inside, what are the things that folks on the outside need to be doing to push and challenge, right? As a person on the outside, no piece of legislation, right, that the Democrats push is going to have everything I want. And so part of what I have to do is continue to push and challenge to try to move the conversation, move the needle. And I mean, you understand both sides probably better than most, right? And so for folks who are advocating and pushing, what do members of Congress need to hear to continue to get to this point? Because to be clear, right, if you had asked most people 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, would there be a policing bill this year? Most people would have said, no, there's no policing bill. There's a policing bill now because a movement rose up, because people took to the streets, because people demanded change, because tragedies happened and people died, and folks did not allow them to die in silence without action. And so much of that is part of what's happening now. And so it'd be interesting, I think, for people to hear from someone in power, an elected official, tell us like about how you see that inside outside.
Mm-hmm. Sure, Rashad, and let me tell you, there has been a sea change. I mean, we are going through a transformation in this country because of young people, because of Black people, because of people of color, and because of the horrific murders that have taken place that have just given rise to systemic racism. And people are beginning to try to understand what that means. And so I think what's important is, first of all, we have to push the envelope on the inside. As a progressive, and I'm gonna give you one example. I just introduced a resolution to cut the military budget in half. This $350 billion cut. We don't need $738 billion to keep this country safe. We need more money to protect our troops, because so many of them are living on food stamps and 8A programs, and I mean the Section 8 program, and deserve a better quality of life. We're building weapon systems that are for obsolete wars. And we specifically showed where those cuts can come from, which don't impair our national security and which really give us resources because that's where the money is in the Pentagon budget, resources to be able to do what we have to do. And so what happens with the inside-outside strategy? That's pushing the envelope. Okay, we've got about 20 co-sponsors, and we're just like, oh my God, you're gonna cut it? Well, yeah, we're gonna cut it. And then we have to educate people, the outside groups. Everyone has to educate people why we have to restructure our budget priorities in this country on every budget. With Pentagon, this is just an example because I'm currently doing this. And so that outside push to educate the public has got to happen. But then we got to take it to the next level, and that is register to vote, because you have to be able to hold members of Congress and elected officials accountable. If you're not registered to vote, I mean, it's going to be, yeah, right. Okay, well, it sounds good, but is this, what's going to happen at the polls? And so part of what we have to do with our street heat is turn this into a political movement. And I know some are going to say we can't do that, but if you have to count them, 435 members of Congress, you have to have 218 right now to get off the floor. Okay, you have to have a Senate that's going to pass it, and you have to have a White House. So, and policies and federal legislation is not everything. That's just a piece of what we need to deconstruct systemic racism and to rebuild in this country. But please participate in the census, and please register to vote, and please turn this into a political movement, because we have to have that we have to have you pushing elected officials to get the job done.
I want to get us to end on this final sort of piece for you to talk a little bit about, because you just made a perfect point, right? That voting is incredibly important, but voting alone, right, and elected official people alone is not going to end systemic racism. But nothing singular alone. It's going to take a lot of different forces, and if we don't vote, we're going to hurt later. And we can't win if we don't vote, and our opponents know that they can't win if we do. It's why they spend so much time, money, and resources putting barriers in our way to actually voting. And if anyone needs any example, look at what just happened with Georgia in those primaries, right? And so you recently introduced some legislation and are moving some legislation and working on getting co-sponsors around truth and reconciliation, around actually getting to the true core of the story with some structural change underneath around exactly how we got here, why we're here in this moment. So often when these moments happen and people want to take action, it's almost like we're sort of starting from scratch, like this incident was racist, but not the system and the structure that was racist. We put a lot of attention on this sort of like these individual acts and not all the sort of things we have to change and undergird it. And part of truth and reconciliation is being able to tell the right story so we can get to the right solutions, not just stories that make inequality and racism look like it's a car accident, but really help people understand that it's unjust, that it's actually part of baked in the structure. So can you talk a little bit about what you're proposing, sort of the kind of undergirds of why and how you need folks to sort of engage to make, to give it more lift, more visibility, more air?
Well, it's truth-telling time, Rashad. And what I have done is introduced a resolution. It's called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Context for the brutal murders of Black and brown people, men and women. Context, 401 years ago, slavery. The truth has never been told about the Middle Passage and the connection between what happened during slavery and what's happening on the streets of America today, or what's seen in the disproportionate rates of African Americans dying of COVID, or what the connection is between 401 years ago and African Americans being low-wage workers, primarily over 50%, and the wealth gap and substandard housing and unequal education. People don't make that connection. 40 countries around the world have had truth and reconciliation commissions after brutal human rights violations, after genocide, after all kinds of destructive policies. Remember, slavery was a government-sanctioned policy. We have never had a truth-telling moment in this country. And we're not calling ours reconciliation because we say there's nothing to reconcile in America.
All right.
We want to transform. And so this commission, and I hope Color of Change will help us get more co-sponsors, because what we want to do, and it's not a study, and it's not another just rhetorical kind of effort. We want people to come forward, tell the truth about systemic racism and how the Black codes and how Jim Crow and how segregation and how lynchings and how mass incarceration impacts systemic racism today. Then come up with, hopefully then people can really begin to make the connections, because I have learned that a lot of people don't know. Some of my white liberal friends are asking me about the disproportionate rates of COVID killing African Americans and don't see the connection about health disparities and discrimination and 401 years ago. And so we have to make the case so people will understand that. And then we can move forward and develop policies that deconstruct or break the chains of 401 years ago and begin to really develop a society that's based on justice for all. Until we do that, and these 40 plus countries who've done it will tell you in a minute that was necessary, it had to happen. And so we're going to push really hard until we get this public kind of discussion taking place about slavery 401 years ago and the connection to what is happening today and what we need to do about it to move forward.
I love that, right? Because part of this work, right, we have to build awareness to actually spur action, right? At Color of Change, we're all about this sort of awareness to action, right? And what you're sort of proposing here, right, is being able to make sure we are telling a more accurate story. I hear people sometimes say Black communities are vulnerable. And I will say, Black people are not vulnerable. Black communities aren't vulnerable. We have been attacked. We have been targeted. And part of what you're trying to do here is help people understand the nature of that, so that when it's time to take action, folks are taking action that makes sense, not simply providing more charity, but providing more justice.
Yeah, that's right.
change. And that is so incredibly important. Is there anything you want to leave folks with as we sort of wrap up? And hopefully, we'll find more time together in the future. But, anything you want to leave folks with as they are out in the world fighting for change and looking to find the right avenues to do it?
Well, Rashad, let me just say, these are some very sad times. Everyone's angry. Some are stressed out. But there's so much hope in this moment. And it's because of people, especially young people of all backgrounds coming together and saying enough is enough. And so what I want to say is just be encouraged, and just understand that this is our moment together to run this lap of the race. And don't give up. We've got to stay with it, be persistent, challenge the powers that be on all fronts. And that I am so happy that we're talking about not tinkering around the edges anymore, but really deconstructing and reconstructing. And so just know that this is a moment of hope in spite of all of the other terrible things that are going on in our community. So we have to really balance all of this out and just know that we're the ones who are going to make the change.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, of Oakland, we love you and appreciate you. Keep fighting. We're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep growing. We're going to keep challenging and trying to do everything we can. But I like that piece about keep running the race, because that's what we have to keep doing. Keep running the race to make as much change possible.
Yeah, let me mention one thing. I got to close.
Oh yeah, do it.
Listen. We talked about the Black Panther Party, but remember, it was the Black Panther Party that stood down the police on behalf of the Black communities way back in the day, okay? Yep. And so just know this is something that has a historical context also. And to know that that was the right action then, and they had the 10-point program to feed kids, that the Black Panther Party started the first breakfast program for children, the George Jackson Medical Clinic, the first clinic. We had survival rallies, gave out food and shoes and everything else that people needed to survive. And so just know that there's a historical context for really systemic change and movements. Unfortunately, J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO, got in the way. But I think this history is important to reflect upon as we move forward.
I think that history is important too, as we move, and we will see attacks on our movements, as we will see right-wing forces try to divide us, try to seed stories and misinformation and disinformation. That is one other point that we have to recognize all the ways in which our movements were attacked in the past and remain vigilant. And so I appreciate that point as well.
So stay woke.
Stay woke. Appreciate you.
Okay,
Take
thank
care,
you.
and we will talk again.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining us at The Black Response. Visit The Black Response to check out more information on our COVID action work to respond to this crisis. Go to colorofchange.org to really get involved in all the work we are doing around police accountability and criminal justice, and continue to take action, both locally and nationally. Join a group in your local community. Join a national group. But whatever you do, let's join together to channel this presence, this visibility, into the ability to actually change the rules. I'll see you next.
That's right. Thank you.